So just to introduce myself for those that weren't at the AGM this morning, my name's Mark Purcell, and it's my honour to serve the members of ACFID with the Australian Council for International Development as CEO. And it's my great pleasure to introduce this next very exciting panel, which is about human rights, but also just interrogating some of the notions or the assumptions within human rights. So in our sector, rights-based approaches have gone from being sort of an issue just of human rights lawyers back in the 90s to becoming mainstream now in most organisations' work, with empowerment at the front and centre of international development programs to tackle injustice and disadvantage. But as we've heard this morning, in a context of shrinking civil society space in some places, rising inequality, the threats, the environmental threats of climate change, what does this hold for people's human rights? How are we to develop new approaches for the coming decades that will cut through? So we have a stellar panel, and to moderate it, we're very, very pleased to have Scott Stephens, who is our panel chair and editor of the ABC's Religion and Ethics website and co-host of The Minefield. I'm sure you've all heard it on ABC Radio National. He's published widely on moral philosophy, theological ethics and political theory, and he's got a new book out, coming out just in time for Christmas, I hope, called On Contempt from Melbourne University Press. So please come up, Scott, with our panellists. Our panel is Elaine Pearson, who's the director of Human Rights Watch in Australia. And prior to joining Human Rights Watch, Elaine worked for the UN and various NGOs around the region, from Kathmandu to Hong Kong, and she sits on the board of the Global Alliance Against Trafficking of Women. Our next panellist is the wonderful cross-cultural interpreter and consultant Tasneem Chopra. She's recently been appointed as an anti-racism champion by the Australian Human Rights Commission. And through her work, she speaks to issues of leadership, diversity, cultural competence, and intersectional discrimination. Tasneem is also chair of the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights. Then from the region, we have Savina Nongbatu, who is the previous president of the advocacy organisation People with Disabilities Solomon Islands, and she was also the first female co-chair of the Pacific Disability Forum. In 2012, she received the US Secretary of State's Award for International Women of Courage for overcoming adversity and championing the cause of people living with disabilities in the Solomon Islands. So welcome, Savina. And finally, we have our board member and CEO of TIER Australia, Matthew Moray, who has over half a century of experience working at the coalface of development in Africa, but then also here running TIER Australia, and he's also Vice President of ACFID and on the Executive Committee for both the Campaign for Australian Aid and MICA Australia. Over to you, panel.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here with this extraordinary group of people. I feel positively outclassed. It's also wonderful that the Solomon Islands is my favorite place in the whole world. My family used to live there. My parents taught at Selwyn College on Guadalcanal. I visited Maleta and Santa Isabella many, many times. So anyway, that's just a private conversation. Don't mind us. Look, it's wonderful to be here. It's a tremendous honor, of course, to be here with you all and to discuss what I think is actually one of the great moral contradictions of our time. And the contradiction goes something like this. We live in a time that is saturated with human rights language, from domestic politics through to international law, through to the media. I mean, human rights is the language, the moral language of choice of modern media and has been since about 1977. So we live in a time where human rights language saturates so many aspects of our common life. And yet somehow at exactly the same time, human rights has never been, I think since its inception, in a more perilous state. Human rights language, if you like, has been exposed as, yes, vital for the way that we think about ourselves and the possibilities and the obligations of human community, I'm so sorry if I'm speaking too fast, by the way. I'll try to slow down. So not only is it indispensable for the way we think about our common community and what we owe one another, but it's not sufficient to guarantee the very things that human rights are meant to be describing. In other words, we live, I think, and this is probably the best way of trying to frame this contradiction, that nation states can strip people of the ability to have their rights realized, but states cannot fully guarantee the conditions within which those rights can be realized. And so, unfortunately, I think one of the things that we are confronting today is that human rights has been seen for now 70 years as something like a common human fact, whereas in actuality, human rights needs to be recovered as a common human task. It's something that we are all entrusted with to accomplish, to achieve, to pursue. I've been thinking for the last year way too much about the problem of contempt. I'm going to be a little bit self-indulgent in saying this, but then it's over to you. It struck me very early on, especially in the way that the notion of contempt was being used by civil rights activists and early human rights lawyers, that contempt is fundamentally a moral deformation of the eyes. It's very interesting that contempt is usually associated with the inability to see another human being as another human being. So one very prominent philosopher described contempt as soul blindness. Soul blindness. And the task of human rights from the very beginning was to try to form the eyes, was to try to create capabilities in people no matter where they are, no matter what communities or political environments in which they belong, to create the capacity to see other human beings as human beings and therefore as deserving, as being owed something profound, something deep. So again, contempt is the great enemy, if you like, of political discourse in the 20th century, and it becomes the mortal enemy then of the task of human rights. And yet we see, I think, everywhere the danger that human rights are being placed under by other claims made by people, made by states that push human rights further and further down the agenda. In other words, it's ended up being something incredibly disposable. You can trade away human rights. So I'm just wondering if this is the way that might be the best way, given the range of expertise here. This might be the best way, I think, of beginning our conversation. What does human rights demand? Not simply what does it say about us, but what does it require as a response from other people? That's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, if it makes certain demands, who are the agents that need to fulfill that demand? In other words, how deep does the demand to have one's human rights recognized go? Is it simply the nation state? What about civil society? What are the then groups that need to occupy that in order to give people the full recognition that they owe? What about the demand that's placed on neighbors? Who would like to go first? Elaine, you look like you're warming up.
Yeah, I think I'm ready.
Good.
And as, I guess, the representative of Human Rights Watch, I feel like I should respond to your question. Well, look, I mean, human rights obviously apply to all of us equally. Every individual has human rights, but it's up to governments to uphold those rights. And I guess it's our role as civil society to hold governments to account. That's certainly the way in which, we see our role. And I think, what we've seen in recent years, given the trends of rapid technological change, growing inequality in countries, we've seen certain politicians flourish by trying to portray human rights as only applying to the other. So it's the human rights of migrants, it's the human rights of asylum seekers, it's the human rights of terrorists or pedophiles. We see this, with our own government talking about we need strong encryption laws, for example, in order to protect us. And it's these pesky human rights that are getting in the way of us being able to protect your security. And I think that's a really dangerous path for us to go down, because if we think about the context of why we have the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, why we have all these conventions and treaties, it was about preventing these atrocities that happened in World War II. And it was about getting governments to agree to a certain set of rules. So when we have governments starting to say things like, well, we don't want to be lectured to by the UN, I think that is a really, dangerous path, because, we should be standing up and upholding rights for everyone.
This raises two very, very important questions, I think, that I'm going to then ask the rest of the panel about. One is, let's face it, for the last 70 years, human rights have been one of the great weapons of international organizations and international law to try to shame nations into improving their human rights. In other words, they've been very effective at stigmatizing, but maybe not quite as effective as we would hope of creating the political atmosphere within which those rights can flourish locally on terms that are recognizable for the people who live there. I think we can probably say that international stigma isn't quite what it used to be. Politicians are now campaigning on the platform of, we won't let these international organizations tell us what to do. We're speaking for all people, not just those at the margin. So I think that really is one very, very important thing. Can we move beyond human rights language, international language, as simply stigmatizing? Can it become really about local empowerment? But I think the other thing, and Matthew, I'm really quite curious what you have to say about this. Are governments, are states the primary upholders of human rights? Are they the fundamental agents of human rights, or is there another game in town?
Yeah, well, I think, as you say, it's interesting that we hear more and more everywhere the discussion of human rights. The Sustainable Development Goals, which Senator Moore was alluding to, are all framed around this concept of rights. An organization kind of analyzed the SDGs and said how many of the 169 targets in the 17 goals actually relate to rights, and something like 92% of them are actually based in human rights. And I actually think the power of the SDGs is actually, I think that they are a very hopeful vision of what the world can be, and a very hopeful commitment that governments have made of what the world could be and how we should be working. But the actual outworking is where we're seeing the problems. And I think, there's a couple of themes that I think play into this, one of which I think is the role of media and truth-telling. I was just with one of our partners in a country in Southeast Asia, and the fact that I can't name him or name the country is because he said that if I did, in this context, his life would be at risk. He works with indigenous people groups he's an environmental activist, and they're trying to protect forests. And he was saying one of his big concerns is many of his peers have been killed in the line of work that he's doing. But what he's seeing, and where he sees governments actually not stepping up, is actually speaking out against these things. So in his context, he was saying to me as an Australian working with an Australian organization, he's saying what you can do to help us is actually have the Australian government speak up against these rights violations, because it's not happening. And the silence means that the local government, and the people who are acting against them are empowered to do more and to continue to undermine their voice and continue to take their rights away. So I think, and why I said I think truth plays an important part of this, because I think part of our role as civil society is to listen. We've heard a lot about listening to the voices and hearing from the communities, hearing the rights. And so I think it's not just about what we see, but it's how we hear impacts how we understand others. But actually hearing their stories and then giving voice to them and making sure that they're told and speaking truth to power in ways that actually are heard and don't get buried by a media that doesn't want to hear a narrative about injustice or about inequality or about change that needs to happen.
This, again, poses, I think, I'm not sure what you all will think about this, and I'm maybe putting my head on the block here. But this raises for me a really kind of urgent moral question. One of the great critiques of human rights discourse from the very beginning is that it was the language of mere survival. Hannah Arendt, one of the great philosophers who was also a critic of human rights, even though she upheld the principle of human rights very strongly, she said it's no wonder that many of the early advocates of human rights borrowed language from the RSPCA to frame human rights commitments. In other words, human beings were being reduced to endangered species. And so there was a kind of, what we need to do is to prevent people from sinking into the abyss. There's a kind of basic needs approach to human rights. Whereas what was being missed was the notion that human rights need to lead to human flourishing, that there's a maximalist understanding of rights. How does this then track on what we've been talking about, Tasneem? It's on.
I would posit that, historically there was this philosophy behind human rights, which was all about, savior and the saved. And that was all very comfortable, that all works very well. But when the saved want to have sovereignty in how their rights are negotiated, that suddenly becomes, it can ruffle the feathers of the establishment, of the institution, of the nation state. Because, if you take the premise that, meaningful change can be achieved when you afford in groups the resources to be agents of change themselves, that means you have to then relinquish power to that group. And that becomes problematic. So I think we've reached a point where there's a questioning. Human rights are really about the sovereign independence and ability for a community to flourish, or is it about the capacity for one agent to control another? And I think when we question that moral underpinning and who actually stands to benefit from a human rights exchange, I think that changes the dynamic of, in fact, what motivates human rights interventions in the first place.
Savina, please.
Thank you. I think for the human rights movement, after 70 years, we're still speaking about it. I think it's a bit depressing for those that have gone before us. But I think in the Pacific, your first question about is it solely the government's role to address this, and I would argue yes, because for the Pacific, services and all that is done by the government. So we have countries that their way of implementing human rights is by virtue of the treaties that they ratify at the UN, but also to other other laws that they have. But I think for effective implementation, when it comes to that, then a government should be able to track its progress as well, in implementing those treaties, whatever they are. Now, for people with disabilities, most of the time, we are not in these, conversations or these fancy-looking papers. So, in the Pacific, we have this, I think there is an absence of our countries actually tracking themselves, what's going good, what's not so good. And there are conversations again on National Human Rights Institution. I think that hasn't happened yet, but it would be great. But I think for us, people with disabilities, unless we are given the opportunity, the access to be heard at meetings, at such meetings, but also, not having just a one-time opportunity to come and talk. But, I know a lot of organizations here also they have regional organizations. Being able to see a person with a disability as equal and realizing the value that they bring to the table and realizing that potential that we can bring, being part of the solution. We don't want to be seen as burden. So I think an Australian government has been a great friend of people with disabilities in the Pacific, but there is more to be done. And we want to be on that, around that table as well with whoever and whichever sector that works with people, not as people with disabilities, but just as a citizen of the country.
Can I ask you all about, thank you, Savina. Can I ask you all about the benefits and the drawbacks of international scrutiny, or even of media scrutiny? Because I felt for a long time that it's a bit of a mixed bag. Obviously, the international spotlight can be incredibly effective in drawing attention to perfidious abuses. It can create forms of mutual accountability, can lead to things like either sanctions or form of diplomatic pressure. That is obviously, I think, important on a number of levels. At exactly the same time, if we think about human rights, not simply as, if you like, scraping the bottom of what human beings owe one another, but being a richer conception of the contexts, the conditions within which human beings can flourish and enjoy the company and the autonomy and the self-determination of one another, then there's also something counterproductive about all of this scrutiny in a particular place when everything is going to hell, as if that is the condition in such places. But then when something like normality returns, international focus, international concern, or more systemic forms of accountability, then move on. The impression that we get is the West more or less has it together and the rest are pretty much a basket case because that's the only time the media seems to be paying attention. Is international accountability being used as productively as it can be? Or is there a better story, I think, that can be told about the way in which forms of international understanding and knowledge can be cultivated?
I think for us in the Pacific, having, being under microscope, so to speak, it's great in some instances. But I think that would work well if it's also home-owned. So my government is also in this. It's not because DFAT is, providing this, so we have to front up and, be all cordial. But as soon as DFAT leaves, everything's the same again. So having an avenue where the civil society are also at the table discussing, and the speakers this morning emphasized on dialogue, having dialogue. There's no rocket scientists in this. You just have to talk to people. And sometimes, coming from a cultural background, we also use, culture can be good and bad, sure. But in terms of having scrutiny, for example, I come from Pacific where violence against women is really high. And there's a lot of women working on it. But we cannot move forward unless we have men with us and be advocating for our issues. And whilst we might be, bits and pieces of information saying the great work that we are doing in country, supported by funders, that's all good. But I think always it's a missing mechanism within the country itself, having those places where, the money comes in and this is the outcome from this. So I think scrutiny, public is good, but it has to come up with, homegrown ideas that people, and I think people themselves are experts on where they live and their respective work and the sectors.
Just really quickly, I think international scrutiny or media in highlighting issues of human rights abuses is essential. It's a very effective way between international media and social media of fast-tracking knowledge so that it's shared, people are aware, whether it's the girls who were kidnapped in Nigeria, for example, or what's happening in Myanmar to the Rohingyas. Without international scrutiny, we know that far too often incidences of human rights abuses go unnoticed, go unchecked, and persist. So it is absolutely essential. But the danger is always, once the lens moves on to the next tragedy, what happens? And I think there's that fatigue that we all experience as, I guess, recipients of trauma, in perpetuity when it comes to social media, international media. And I feel that people shortchanged in those exchanges are those suffering. And I think that we need, how we reach a balance of maintaining and sustaining interest and action towards the myriad of traumas and abuses, I don't have a solution to yet, but I think that's where the needle has to shift.
I mean, maybe just to add on to that, your question made me think a lot about Sri Lanka and how, the war in Sri Lanka, those awful atrocities that happened, particularly in the final months of the war where we saw shelling that killed tens of thousands of civilians, it was so difficult to get international attention on what was happening because the Sri Lankan government was very effective in kicking out international journalists, in kicking out international aid organisations, and in hiding what was going on. So there was never, I was working in New York at the time, there was never a discussion in the UN Security Council about those atrocities. And it was really difficult to get those issues onto the UN Human Rights Council. It happened eventually, and there was a commitment from the Sri Lankan government to establish a hybrid court to examine those abuses. But of course what happened is, we had an election, things moved on, diplomats said, things are a lot better in Sri Lanka. Don't worry about it. Forget about the past. Let's just look forward. And what's happened over the weekend? We see that Mahinda Rajapaksa has come back into power, which I think is chilling for so many Tamils and also so many civil society activists and journalists working inside Sri Lanka. And this is why accountability is really important. I don't think it should be a matter of sort of either or, international scrutiny or sort of domestic, but I think it's really a matter of the two working together and really, I guess, working with to support our partners in these countries, particularly where it can be hard for them to have a voice or to take that voice internationally.
And I think accountability is one of the key questions in this discussion, and it's not just accountability at the international level. Though, as I said, this partner that I was talking to, they said actually Australia raising its voice to his government actually makes a difference for the rights campaigners at the grassroots level. That actually makes a difference. But I think for us, as many of us are NGOs in the room, as we think about accountability, accountability also comes back to how we work with community groups and what role we play in building accountability systems and reinforcing and being accountable ourselves. Beyond that, you kind of gave that potential kind of paradigm of, you know, things are good in the West and the rest of the world's a basket case. And talking about accountability, I think you don't have to look much further than our own backyard in terms of injustice issues here with our First Peoples. And the way that media can be used, I think, to hold governments accountable and raise rights issues isn't just in the formal media. I think the Kids Off Nauru campaign that World Vision's helped to champion and many of us are involved with is a great example of how social media and people's movements can actually start to hold government to account on things that need to be discussed.
One of the visions that the central influences, the central framers of the UN Declaration of Human Rights had in mind is, on the one hand, they were trying to gather together and canonize, if you like, certain things that no nation of good conscience and in good standing would dispute. There was a kind of gathering together of not a lowest common denominator, but what would have been fundamentally shared across the civic and political spaces of those who signed up. In other words, it wasn't so much of a program going forward as it was a taking stock of where we are. At the same time, the UN Declaration of Human Rights also imagined itself as instilling a kind of pedagogy. It's a strange term, and I apologize for it, but it wasn't just a program out there. It was something that needed to be taught and given expression in local communities. There was not even any sense among some of the great minds of the UNHCR that the language would be all that important. What was important is that this took root in places, that it could then be instilled in various local settings. You've all raised, I think, in various ways, the importance of locality, the importance of not just self-scrutiny and self-accountability, but how it is that human rights goes from something that's out there to something that's part of the lifeblood of local communities. I was even struck recently by a recent book by Michael Ignatieff, a great human rights advocate himself, going various places around the world and discovering human rights language has nothing to do with the moral language of people in local either villages or towns or cities. They use older language. They use religious language. How do we begin to bridge that gap between human rights discourse out there and international scrutiny? What does commitment to human rights look like on the ground in its relationship with religious communities, in its work in building both domestic infrastructure and civil society capabilities for debate and productive disagreement? What does that bridging look like?
Maybe I'll just jump in there. I think as we think about the framework of how the intersection between perhaps religious communities and human rights, I think it's important to recognize that I work with a faith-based organization, at least from the Christian tradition, and actually many faith traditions. There is a very deeply ingrained, they wouldn't use rights language, but in my tradition it would be, going back to the Latin, it was imago Dei, which was this sense that humans were created in the image of God, and thus there is a dignity in every one of the 8 billion people who walks the earth. And so that's and you'll find similar threads in many religious traditions. And I actually think that that's the language of human rights. It's about dignity. It's about recognizing that people are inherently valuable and have those inherent rights. So while the language may be different, I actually think it's certainly not a Western construct, and it wasn't invented when the UN started talking about this. I think this is much deeper, and I think that's something that resonates with people, because this is what there's something deeper in the human experience that rights are the way we're meant to be, the way we're meant to relate to each other, the way that healthy community and relationship is meant to work. So I think there's some resonance beyond just the human rights language.
I think for me as a person with a disability, but also for my brothers and sisters, the language, sometimes English is our fourth or fifth language. So, we have these fancy treaties, and then we're trying, as advocates in country, and because we are persons with disabilities, most of our children won't go to school in the first place. That would mean they won't be able to read or write. But then the challenge is on the advocate. How do we go into the community and preach something that, one, as a strange thinking, human rights, but let alone try to make it as pleasant for them to also understand. And we have this we've been battling with this for many years now. But I think apart from language, people with disabilities, I think for us, human rights will be simply access to education, access to clean water, employment, women and girls having access to justice when abuse happens, having that access to whatever services or to the police to report. These are human rights to us. We won't be looking at the fancy words that are in the papers, but for us, if you're talking human rights, then this is it. That you are able to help me along this journey to be able to go to school, be able to work and bring my potential and value to the table. So yes, language is important, but in our own islands as well, some of us don't have the word for disability. Maybe it's never been thought. I'd like to think so. But now with new language coming in, people are trying to find, so how do we define it? And sometimes when international partners come into the country as well, they ask us, so how do you, I had this interesting conversation with somebody from Justice. They said, so do you have a definition for disability in your constitution? Constitution being the mother document of the country. And I looked at him and I said, possibly not, because I don't have it either. But for us, I think it's important changes on the ground, and I guess access is important for us to be, to be able to be as human beings. And like my colleague said here, most of the Pacific Islanders are Christian countries, or we claim we are Christian countries. But it is no secret that people with disabilities still miss out for that. So we, as an advocacy organization, also try to use the religion angle to also try and work, how do we include persons with disabilities? If you and I say we are images of God, then why are we putting up structures that wheelchairs can't get into the churches and when we preach? Because I think with violence against women, unless the pastor stands in front and say that, violence is a sin, the congregation might come every Sunday and listen, but then won't take, unless the pastor who's, the guy at the top says that, then of course. But I think for us, human rights will be just the basic access to clean water, health, and justice.
And I guess just coming back to that point that Michael mentioned earlier, I think it's also about telling individual stories that people can relate to about how rights are violated. Because, if I go into an advocacy meeting with a government official, I can tell them that they've violated, article whatever of whatever convention, but I'm not going to be a very effective advocate. But if I can tell them about the human cost of how this has affected a family or an individual, that is, I think, what really moves people, because people say, no, that's wrong, that's unjust, that's not fair. And so I think it is about the way in which, I guess, we can tell some of those stories. And it's more and more also about, I guess, how we involve the public in our work, because I feel like we're having to do that more and more now. We're no longer simply, appealing to a, small segment of the government or politicians, but we actually need the public on board with human rights.
Yeah, I would, just going back to what Matthew was also saying earlier, I think the language of the human rights discourse as we know it in 2018 is a very sort of Western framework. But if I were to link back the work that I do through the organisation Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights, it's quite a mouthful, the work that we do organisationally is really grounded in, I guess, texts and sources of, I guess, Islamic base and theory that are consistent with the human rights approach, but don't name it as such as human rights. And they are about equality, inclusion, respect, protection, and justice. So these are issues that are universal, and they're all about human rights, but they're also very much intrinsically related to a faith base as well. And I think they're consistent with all the major traditions and faiths in general. So I don't think that's unique, but I think the fact that we have human rights language as if it were something else, I think that's a Western paradigm. But I think certainly the ethos of what underpins those ethics has always existed within traditions. Whether or not we manifest them is another story.
My dear friend Raymond Gaeta, as a way of pointing out the absurdity of some of the ways in which we use human rights language, says, just imagine someone said to you that a woman that he knows in Eastern Europe had just been conscripted into a brothel. Oh my God, the brothel owner violated her human rights. You can just tell from the description that those two things don't fit. You need a thicker, you need a richer language to be able to describe the extent, the depth of either human need or of human tragedy. And this raises, that's a very odd anecdote, I apologize, but this raises, I think, a very interesting thing that all four of you would have to wrestle with on various levels. That there is a set of expectations that exists out there among politicians, among those who you look to fund human rights organizations, that really do speak the language of human rights, or if they don't speak the language of human rights, they see with the eyes of human rights. They might prioritize certain forms of development over other things that are less easy to measure. But then on the ground, it's a very different scene. Other things are needed. Other language needs to be spoken. And yet somehow these two things need to be put in connection with one another, either in the interest of international accountability, or in order to secure funding, or in order to bring national, international communities together. Again, that just seems to me to be another very, very difficult bridge, because it's not just language that we're talking about. It's competing visions that don't necessarily overlap. How do you square that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw a study that was done just of funders, large institutional funders over the last, I think it was 10 years. And they showed that actually there's been a big uptick, an increase in grants and funding that's specifically around rights-based programming and that focus. But I don't think...
Can I ask what that looks like? What do you mean rights-based programs?
Sure.
What can you give me an example of one?
Well, I could give you an example of one that I was just at earlier this year in India, where working with a tribal community in a rural part of India, and who was facing, because of their indigenous nature, had been displaced from land, wasn't getting services provided by the government, such as education or healthcare. And so the programming with them, as a kind of the historic way that an NGO might go in, is to go in and actually build the clinic, do the education. But the rights-based approach was going in and working with that community to help them become advocates for their own rights, and to work with government as duty bearers to deliver those programming for the community. And actually, just a small anecdote from that, I mean, one of the most profound things that happened to me on that visit to that community was meeting one of the women who wanted to, we had visited the community and we'd heard a little bit about the work that was going on, and they showed us both the school and the health clinic that they had been able to initiate. But the woman actually said, no, really what the translator was saying, actually this woman wants to speak to you, and the one thing that she wanted to show me was that she could sign her name. And for me, and it was quite a thing for her, because historically her identity had been a thumbprint when she went to get rations or when she voted. And she had become literate and learned how to sign her name. And there's something really profoundly important about dignity. And that was what it was for her. It was the dignity of actually having identity and being able to sign her name. But that translated in a bigger way as well, because the community who'd been empowered in that way they were the women who were going into the government offices and demanding their rights, people who had not had a voice before and had been disenfranchised. So that's the type of programming that I'm talking about. But I was going to say, one of, I think, the big disconnects we have is that the way that we as NGOs raise money in Australia, Tier Australia has a useful gift catalog, so at Christmas time people can buy different gifts, goats and chickens, and many of us have something similar. Well, we do experiment with different types of programming, and we try to align the fundraising to the programming, and a couple of times we've done women's rights, or human rights gifts. Nobody buys those. And the reason they don't buy them, there's a lot of reasons they don't buy them, but one of them is they don't understand it, the language is a bit foreign, but it's not tangible, and people want to have this sense of we've made a tangible difference. And rights-based programming isn't about that tangible, we're going to do something, it's really about we're going to help empower a community, work with a community so they can actually speak up. But I do think there's a significant disconnect in the way that we tell the story of the work that we do and the way we're educating the public. And that's a piece of work we need to be thinking about. How do we actually change the narrative so that our supporters actually understand what rights mean? Maybe the language is wrong, but let's tell the story in ways that talk about the transformation that's happening.
Yeah, okay, I'm thinking of a domestic example, and near the territory that we're talking to. So, federally, there has been a lot of funding attributed towards CVE programs, countering violent extremism issues and problems, because for one reason or another, it's a very topical area of funding. An organisation like ours, which is the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights, has a slew of issues that it needs to address within a welfare lens for its community, foremost amongst them being violence against women. That's by far one of the biggest issues. And as a women's organisation, we're not alone in that fight. Nationally, we know that violence against women is one of the biggest killers of women in this country. Yet, shifting the needle of funding from CVE issues to to violence against women has been an ongoing struggle, because that is not seen to be the major issue that the system designates as an issue that's relevant to my community. They go, well, no. When we're dealing with the Australian Muslim community, we really need to be dealing with extremism and violence, and that's the issue. So it almost comes to the point where then, if we need funding in order to operate and thrive, we actually have to create programs which are not actually addressing the issues that we need to be focused upon, because of an agenda that is actually got a political impetus and not the human rights issue that is actually central to both our community, and women in Australia. So yeah, it's a perpetual battle. Talk about the biggest terror threat in Australia to women. It's violence against women, and not some foreign entity that billions of dollars are being designated towards. So that constant imbalance is the frustration that we've been cycling around now for decades.
I think I just want to say, when you say funding, every time it sort of makes me terrified, really, because increasingly with funding in the region, there's also competition. So some disability, I know from a few years ago, was quite a buzzword. So there was a lot of emphasis on disability. Now we're having new players on the floor, so to speak. We have climate change, how that affects persons with disabilities. But I think also in the civil spaces, it's also shrinking. So people with disabilities organizations are also finding it challenging when you get into a bigger group. And so our issues sometimes get diluted, most of the time, get diluted in all these major. And sometimes funders would look at what is best for their money, the value for money. So maybe it might be not disability, but maybe it's climate change. But then we forget that I think for us, priority here is also to be able to integrate these kind of things when it comes from the government of Australia, and we are grateful for the government of Australia. But these are situations where we also start to think, after so many years now. The voices of other sectors are getting louder as well, and where our spaces to be able to jump up and down and say, you know, don't forget us, because WHO estimates that in any country, 10 to 15% are people with disabilities. Now, when you look at that, for my country, Solomon Islands, that's a big number, around 80,000. So I guess for a public Pacific Disability Forum as a regional organization, we are also competing for the piece of the pie. Wow. How creative we are, that remains to be seen, but I think disability should be mainstreamed across all sectors. Whether some people might argue with me, but I think that is the way to go, and having us being part of that journey.
I have one last question for you all. And I'm going to mangle this a little bit, so please forgive me from the outset. One of the things that expresses contempt, or that contempt is an expression of, is a person's immunity from the demands of another. Immunity, of course, is the negation of the idea of community, or communication, or communion. In other words, there's no relationship between us, really. One of the things that you all have pointed to in one form or another is the tendency to see rights bearers or rights claimants almost as clients, or as problems that need to be solved. Whereas the nature of human rights as an international charter, as a vision for the world, is the creation of a network of ongoing relationships among people. So, for instance, among some nations or some groups, there have been requests, don't give us a one-off grant or charitable donation. What we want is a loan that establishes an ongoing relationship among us. And what you've all kind of demonstrated, and Tasneem, what you mentioned before, I think really strikes me particularly. I mean, the Muslim community in Australia has been used as a source of things that the government wants, rather than a group that can be, into which a good, productive, mutually beneficial relationship can be formed. And it just strikes me that so many of the relationships around the world tend to be utilitarian. It's a problem that needs to be solved, so we throw money at it. Or it's a group of people. So I'm wondering, how can the framework of human rights establish relationships of mutual dependence, can open up lines of communication where it's not simply a higher power imposing upon a local place what they want to see built, or what they want to see done, or where their priorities lie. How can these lines of communication be opened up so that there really can be forms of mutual communication, of real community among them? I mangled the question. There was a rough idea there, and I was kind of feeling my way around it.
Struggling for answers.
I think it's, sorry.
I don't know that I agree with the premise of the question.
Okay,
Because,
excellent.
I do feel like if you look across the region, there are people all across Asia who join protests, who, stand up very forcefully for their rights, only to have them, taken away by their government. And often they come to the international community, or they come to us almost as a last resort. I think when I was in Sri Lanka, like the mothers of all the people who had disappeared during the war, and they're sitting out by the roadside for days, which turned into weeks, which turned into months, because no one was listening to them. So I think for them, whether, they don't know the language of international treaties, but they're very clear about what has happened to them, and that the government has failed them and continues to fail them. So I guess it's about, how we reclaim that language, so that it is really about, providing a voice to the victims.
But surely a voice presumes that the voice can speak and can demand to be heard, rather than having to say the right things or make the right requests in order for the broader community to pay attention. In other words, for that voice to be authentic, it needs to be able to speak on its own terms, in language that really does reflect its own real needs, that gets its arm around the emotional and political dimensions of the tragedy that's unfolding. I guess I worry very frequently that the voice tends to be a bit unidirectional. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I also was struggling with maybe the underlying premise of the question, because I think the reality is it's not, and if it came across that way, I think we didn't communicate well. I don't think we see it as clients or something to be solved. I actually think when we talk about the big problems facing the world today, we're all impacted by them. I mean, climate change isn't about a community somewhere else. Climate change is about us as much as it's about everybody. When we talk about spaces for civil society being tightened or restricted, that's happening here as much as it's happening in other places. So I think for, again, coming back to this vision of the Sustainable Development Goals, but this idea of the world can be a place where people, planet, peace, I mean, a bigger vision for everybody, and that's us as well as the people that we're working with. So I think it is a broken premise to think that it's about fixing something somewhere else. I think it's about fixing something that we're all part of and bringing voice to that.
Excellent, thank you.
I think, for me, I think that kind of partnership will only flourish when both see each other as equal. So, you know, we're able to be sitting at the table, we're able to be frank about what we want, and it might be not what the powerful one wants to hear, but the weak one will be able to, like you said, the voice, to be able to, and that avenue has to be there where the voice can, you know, but also along that journey, that voice gets amplified by the support of others. So when I said civil society is shrinking, we have Australian partners, and they're experiencing this. Can you imagine what's like in the Pacific, where we also still CSO just sort of trying to, you know, get ahead above waters, and sometimes we get under, you know, attacks and all that. So I think a real and effective partnership is seeing each other as equal, no matter what level of that partnership is. And for the Australian government, I think that has been, the relationship has been great with Pacific Island countries, and we are grateful for that. But there needs to be more honest and frank conversation as to exactly what the people need, and that includes persons with disabilities, and being able to, you know, talk to us about it.
Tasneem, I'm going to give you the final word.
No, I would agree that it is an inequality. There's an inequality, and being seen as equals is an initial part of the solution in any relationship where there's an us and them. I think, but to go even beyond recognising that we need to be equal partners, I think a perfect, ideal outcome would actually be for the us to be inclusive of them in the decision making and in the planning. So there needs to be representation of the very communities that we serve included in whatever decisions we make about those communities. I think there's a fundamental lacking of that. We do tend to sort of, you know, in this sector, it does tend to be, you know, predominantly either whitewashed or very much West versus the other. And I think we need to shift that. We need to start changing the way projects are designed, projects are governed, and then they're rolled out. So once they're immediately then inclusive of those communities, you are hopefully going to mitigate a lot of cultural misconception and mistakes.
Well, I doubt you've learned as much as I have. I've learned an extraordinary amount from you four. It's stuff you already know, so I hope you enjoyed listening in. This was marvelous. Thank you so much for joining me in the conversation. Will you please join me in thanking our four panelists?
And before the panellists leave, I must say I'm used to hearing Scott Stephens as a disembodied voice, so it's quite nice to know that there's a material presence as well.
It's better as disembodied, I assure you.
Just very quickly, I think it's been a bit of a feast, really, this dialogue with these eminent and articulate panellists. We began with the notion of the human rights language saturating the public discourse. Matthew reminded us that 92% of the SDGs are based in human rights, and that set a great context. I like the fact that all of the panel seem to tacitly agree that there is a role for the Australian government as an influencer in the region, and large presence, keeping human rights issues on the agenda, all seem to agree as well of the need for scrutiny, whether it's by formal agencies or the role of the media, including social media. I think all seem to agree too that religious traditions have the inherent dignity of humans at their core, and that's also traditions that we ought to be able to rely on to protect human rights. I think we've had a very sophisticated, thoughtful discussion here today, and we have a small token of appreciation to Matthew Morey. These are named, so I have an assistant to deal with these. Thank you, Matthew. To Savina Longbatu, thank you very much. To Tasneem Chopra, thank you very much. To Elaine Pearson, thank you. Great insights from your experience in Sri Lanka, and to our embodied panel chair, Scott Stevens. Thank you all.